The letter arrived on a Tuesday. Standard envelope. My name, my address, a bank I had never opened an account with. A payment reminder for a loan I had never taken. $14,200, past due. I read it twice. Then I sat down. Then I picked up the phone. Not to call the bank, to call Margaret. Margaret had been my accountant for 16 years. Margaret knew every financial instrument connected to my name. Margaret would tell me in under 10 minutes whether this letter was an error or something else entirely. It took her 7 minutes. Margaret said, "Eleanor, this is not an error." She paused. Margaret said, "There are 3 of them. 3 loans. My name, my credit, my signature. Forged, she believed, but my signature. $41,600. I said, "How long?" Margaret said, "The oldest one is 14 months. 14 months! I had not known for 14 months. I set the letter down on my kitchen table. I already knew who had done it. I just needed to decide what I was going to do about it. My name is Eleanor Brooks, 62 years old, Connecticut, retired teacher. I have one son, Lucas, 38 years old. I have loved him without condition for 38 years. That did not change when Margaret told me about the loans. But something else changed. The particular quality of trust that exists between a mother and a son who has never given her reason to doubt him. That changed in 7 minutes on a Tuesday morning. Let me tell you how it started. 14 months ago, Lucas lost a significant client. He is an architect, a good one. He had been working with a development company for 3 years, a substantial contract, the kind that forms the financial backbone of a small practice. The company restructured. The contract ended. Lucas absorbed the loss quietly, the way he absorbs most difficult things, without drama, without asking for help, without telling me the full extent until much later. Nicole told me some of it, not all of it. The version Nicole told me had the particular shape of information that has been edited for a specific audience. Nicole said, "Lucas is navigating a difficult period. Things will stabilize. They have a plan." I said, "If you need anything, tell me." Lucas said, "We're fine, Mom, thank you." He said it 3 times over 3 months. Each time I believed him, because he was my son, because he had never lied to me, because I had no reason to look at the paperwork. What I did not know during those 3 months, I did not know that Lucas had taken out a personal loan in January, $14,200. A bank he had found online, fast approval, my name on the application, my social security number, my credit score doing the work that his damaged credit could not do. I did not know that 6 weeks later he had done it again. $11,000. Different bank, same method. I did not know that 4 months after that he had done it a 3rd time. $16,400. 3 loans, 3 banks, 14 months, $41,600 borrowed in my name. Without my knowledge, without my consent, without a single conversation. Margaret found all 3 in under 7 minutes. I said, "How is his credit now?" Margaret said, "Recovered significantly. The loans are current on his end. He has been making the payments. Current on his end. Making the payments. With money from somewhere. While I received a past due notice for a loan I did not know existed. I sat at my kitchen table. I thought about 38 years. I thought about the way Lucas looked at me when he was 7 years old and broke a window and came to tell me before I found out himself. The particular expression of a boy who understood that honesty mattered more than comfort. I thought about that boy. I thought about the man who had borrowed $41,600 in his mother's name and said, "We're fine, Mom, thank you." Then I called Patricia. If you have ever trusted someone completely and discovered the trust had a limit you did not know about, stay with me. Because what I did next took 3 weeks and changed everything. Subscribe and hit the bell. I post every week. Patricia listened. No interruptions. No reassurances, just the focused silence of a woman receiving information and organizing it. When I finished, she said, "How do you want to proceed?" I said, Tell me the legal picture first. Patricia said, identity fraud. Forgery. Those are the technical categories. The fact that he is your son does not change the legal nature of what he did. I said, and my options? Patricia said, report it formally, or handle it privately. I said, privately. Patricia said, I thought you would say that. But Eleanor, private does not mean quiet. Private means the consequences stay in the family. It does not mean there are no consequences. I said, I know. Patricia said, I will prepare the paperwork. I spent the next week watching, not confronting, not calling, watching. Lucas came for Sunday dinner. He came in smiling. He brought wine. He asked about my garden. He ate the meal I cooked. He told me about a new project he had pitched. He said things were turning around. I watched his face the entire evening, looking for the thing I had missed for 14 months. I found it. Not guilt exactly, compartmentalization. The specific quality of a person who has placed something in a box and closed the lid and learned to live in the rooms that do not contain the box. Lucas had put the loans in a box. He had closed the lid. He had come to Sunday dinner and brought wine and asked about my garden. That was before I checked the second credit bureau. Margaret had checked one. I asked her to check the others. She called on Wednesday. Margaret said, Eleanor, there is a fourth one. I sat down. Margaret said, smaller, $6,400. A credit union in Hartford. Taken out 8 months ago. 8 months ago. 2 months after he told me things were fine. 4 loans. $48,000. $48,000 borrowed in my name across 14 months while Lucas came to Sunday dinner and brought wine and asked about my garden. I said, Margaret, my credit score. Margaret said, it has taken a hit. Not catastrophic, but significant. The past due notice has been reported. 1 loan was past due. Lucas had been making payments on 3 of them. The fourth, $6,400 from a credit union in Hartford, he had apparently forgotten about. My credit score had paid for the forgetting. I called Patricia. I said, there is a fourth one. Patricia said, I know, I found it this morning. I said, $48,000 total. Patricia said, yes. I said, how is his credit score right now? Patricia said, 712. I said, and mine? Patricia said, 681. He had borrowed my credit, used it, improved his. Mine had declined while his recovered. I sat with that for a long time. That was before the Sunday he said something at dinner that made the box impossible to ignore. It was 3 Sundays after the first letter arrived. I had said nothing, not one word about the loans. I had cooked the meals. I had poured the wine he brought. I had asked about the project, and I had watched. Lucas put down his fork. Lucas said, Mom, I have been thinking. I might need to refinance something in the next few months. I was wondering, if I needed a co-signer on something, whether you would be open to discussing it. A co-signer? He was sitting at my table asking me to co-sign a loan, while 4 loans in my name sat in banks across Connecticut, while my credit score had dropped 31 points, while Patricia had a folder 2 inches thick on her desk. I looked at my son. I said, What kind of refinancing? Lucas said, Just a consolidation. Some things from the past year that could be structured better. It would help with the monthly cash flow. Some things from the past year. I said, Let me think about it. Lucas said, Of course, no rush. I said, Actually, Lucas, can you come by on Tuesday? I have some paperwork I want to go over with you. Lucas said, Sure, everything okay? I said, Everything is exactly as it should be. I said it the way I always say it when it means the opposite. He smiled. He did not hear the difference. If this moment reached something in you, if you have ever sat across from someone who was hiding something enormous while asking you for more, leave me a comment. Tell me what you did. I read every single one. Lucas arrived at 10 on Tuesday. On time. He is always on time. He came through the front door. Lucas said, "Morning, Mom." I said, "Kitchen." He followed me in. He sat down. I poured coffee. I sat across from him. I placed the folder on the table between us. Not Patricia's folder, mine. 4 tabbed sections, one for each loan. Each section had the original letter, the loan agreement Patricia had obtained, the bank records, and a single-page summary in Margaret's handwriting with the amount, the date, and the credit impact. Lucas looked at the folder. He looked at the tabs. He looked at me. I said, "Open it." He opened to the first tab. He read for approximately 40 seconds. Then he stopped. He already knew what was there. Of course he knew. He had put it there. I said, "January, $14,200, First National Online, my name, my social security number, my signature." Lucas said, "Mom." I kept my eyes on the folder. I said, "March, $11,000, Coastal Credit Services, same method." Lucas said, "I can explain." I raised one hand. I said, "July, $16,400, Hartford Community Bank." Lucas said, "Please." I looked up. I said, "October, $6,400, Riverside Credit Union." Silence. He looked at the table. I looked at him. I said, $48,000, Lucas. He closed his eyes. I said, $48,000 in my name, across 14 months, while you came to Sunday dinner, while you brought wine, while you asked about my garden, while you told me everything was fine. Lucas said, "I was going to pay it back." 3 words. I was going to. I looked at my son, 38 years old, sitting at the same table where he had done his homework at 7. I said, "When?" Lucas said, "When the business stabilized, when the new contracts came through. I had a plan." I said, "You had a plan when you took the first one?" Lucas said, "Yes." I said, "And the second?" Lucas said, "The first one was not enough." I said, "And the third?" Lucas said, "The plan was taking longer than I thought." I said, "And the fourth?" "The one that is past due, the one that dropped my credit score, the one you apparently forgot existed." Lucas looked at the table. Lucas said, "I did not forget. The payment got lost in everything else. And then I was afraid to tell you, and the longer I waited—" I finished his sentence. I said, "The easier it was to keep waiting." Lucas said, "Yes." I said, "Lucas, look at me." He looked up. I said, "You forged my signature 4 times. You used my identity to borrow $48,000. You did this while telling me you were fine. And 3 Sundays ago, you sat at my table and asked me to co-sign another loan." Lucas said, "I know." I said, "What did you think would happen?" Lucas said, "I thought I would fix it before you found out." I said, "And if you had not fixed it?" He said nothing. I said, "If you had not fixed it, I would have found it the way I found it. Through Margaret. Through a past due notice from a bank I have never heard of. Through a credit score that is now 31 points lower than it was 14 months ago." Lucas said, "I am sorry, Mom." I said, "I know you are." I said, "Now let me tell you what happens next." I reached back into the folder. I took out Patricia's document, 8 pages. A formal acknowledgement of debt. Lucas's name at the top, his address, the full accounting of all 4 loans, amounts, dates, banks, total, a repayment schedule, monthly payments directly to me until the full $48,000 was returned. At the same interest rate the banks had charged, a clause that the agreement would be filed with Patricia's office as a legal record. And one final page, a letter to each of the 4 banks formally notifying them that the loans had been taken without the account holder's knowledge, requesting investigation into the forgery. I placed it in front of Lucas. He read every page, slowly. When he finished, he looked up. Lucas said, "The bank letters." I said, "Yes." Lucas said, You are reporting it. I said, I am notifying the institutions that have my name on fraudulent documents. It is the correct and legal thing to do. I am not filing a criminal complaint. I am not going to the police. I am informing the banks. Lucas said, This could affect my credit. I said, Yes. Lucas said, Significantly. I said, Perhaps, in the way that $48,000 borrowed without permission affects the person whose name was used. You experienced that from my side. Now you will understand it from yours. Lucas said, Mom. I said, Lucas, I love you. That is not in question. What is in question is whether you are going to sign this document and begin repairing what you damaged. Not just the credit, the other thing. Lucas said, The trust. I said, Yes, the trust. He looked at the document. He picked up the pen. He signed on the last page. His full name, the date. Then he looked at me with the expression of a man who has just done something irrevocable and understands that irrevocable is not the same as wrong. Lucas said, The co-signing question, 3 Sundays ago. I said, Yes. Lucas said, I was going to use it to consolidate the 4 loans. Pay them off. You would never have seen them. You would have just seen the co-signed consolidation loan, which I would have told you was for the business. I said, I know. Lucas said, You knew? I said, I knew what you were thinking when you asked, not the specific mechanism, the general direction. Lucas said, And you said let me think about it. I said, I needed to see if you would tell me the truth. Lucas said, I was not going to. I said, I know that too. Lucas said, How long have you known about the loans? I said, 3 weeks. Lucas said, 3 Sundays. I said, Yes. Lucas said, You cooked dinner, you poured the wine, you asked about the project. I said, Yes. Lucas said, Why didn't you say something? I said, Because I needed the full picture before I spoke, and because I needed the folder to be complete, and because I wanted you to ask me for the co-signature. I wanted you to make that choice at my table. Freely, Lucas said, So you could see who I was. I said, So I could see who you were choosing to be. He looked at the signed document between us. Lucas said, And now? I said, Now you go home. You tell Nicole. All of it. Not the version. All of it. She signs a witness acknowledgement. Patricia will send it to her directly. And then every month on the 1st you make the payment. Lucas said, And us? I looked at my son, the 7-year-old with the broken window, the man who had borrowed $48,000 in the dark and come to Sunday dinner in the light. I said, We are going to be fine. Not immediately, not without work, but fine. He nodded. He stood up. He stood at the kitchen door for a moment. Lucas said, I am sorry, Mom. Not because of the document, because it was wrong. I said, I know the difference. That is why I believe you. It is 3 weeks later. The first payment arrived on the 1st of the month. Exactly on time, in the full amount Patricia had specified. Margaret has begun disputing the credit impact with each bureau. It will take months. My score will recover. These things always do when the paperwork is correct and the documentation is complete. Nicole called 2 days after the Tuesday meeting. She had known. Not all of it, not the 4th loan, but she had known the general shape of the first 3 and had chosen to believe Lucas would fix it before I found out. Nicole said, I should have told you. I said, Yes, you should have. Nicole said, I was protecting him. I said, I understand that, but protecting someone from consequences is not the same as protecting them. Nicole said, I know that now. She was quiet. Then Nicole said, Eleanor, are you okay? I thought about it honestly. I said, I am okay in the way you are okay when something you believed was solid turned out to have a crack in it. And you have looked at the crack clearly. And you have decided to repair it rather than pretend it is not there. Nicole said, That is a very Eleanor answer. I said, Yes, it is. $48,000. 4 loans, 14 months, 3 Sundays of Sunday dinner where I poured the wine and asked about the garden and waited. Lucas is 38 years old. He signed the document. He makes the payment on the 1st. He is learning something he should have learned at 7. That the people who love you most are also the ones with the longest memories and the most thorough accountants. If you have ever discovered that someone you trusted without question had been doing something behind your back, leave me a comment. Tell me how you found out. Tell me what you did. Tell me if you chose repair or distance. I read every single one. And if this story reached something in you today, subscribe. Because next week's story will stay with you too.